They called her the beast in the sack, but the cowboy found his heart inside it. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's begin the story. It was the kind of place where life moved at its own pace, and the past often whispered louder than the present. In the dusty plains of the Old West, where cattle roamed free and the sun never seemed to set, there was a cowboy who lived alone on a small ranch, far away from the noise and chaos of the nearest town. His name was Jack Thornton, a man whose heart had been hardened by loss and whose trust in others had long been worn thin. Jack had made a life for himself, living in isolation, with only the company of his horses and the distant memories of a life he once shared with others. He had seen too much pain, too much betrayal, and now he preferred to keep to himself. But fate, as it often does, had other plans for him. One day, a letter arrived at his ranch, a letter that would change his life forever. It was from his old friend, a man who ran a large ranch not too far from Jack's. The letter spoke of a young woman, a woman in need of help, who had been abandoned and left with nowhere to go. Her name was Clara, and she had been labeled by society as the beast in the sack. A cruel name, one that haunted her wherever she went. Clara was an outcast, a woman who had been judged harshly by the world for something that was beyond her control. She was overweight, and her appearance made people uncomfortable. They whispered behind her back, calling her names and making cruel jokes about her. But what they didn't know, what they never bothered to see, was the strength that lay within her. Clara had never known kindness from others, never felt the warmth of a family or a friend. She had been raised in a small town where she was ridiculed and treated as less than human. As she grew older, the mocking only intensified. People saw her as a burden, something to be avoided or ridiculed, not someone worthy of love or respect. She had learned to live in the shadows, to hide away from the world that had rejected her. But now, with nowhere else to turn, Clara had reached out to Jack for help. His friend's letter had explained her situation, and it seemed that Jack was the only person who could offer her a chance at a new life. Despite his own reservations and the pain of the past, Jack agreed to take Clara in. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew he couldn't turn his back on someone in need. As Clara arrived at his ranch, she was a sight that would make most men uncomfortable. She was larger than most women, her body a stark contrast to the idealized beauty often celebrated in the towns and cities. But Jack saw something in her eyes, something that made him pause. It wasn't fear or shame, but a quiet strength, a determination that resonated deep within him. The days that followed were not easy. Clara worked hard, doing everything she could to repay Jack's kindness. She tended to the animals, helped with the chores, and learned how to live in the quiet, simple way Jack had chosen for himself. Slowly, the two began to understand each other. Jack, who had long buried his own emotions, found himself drawn to Clara's resilience, her ability to smile through the pain, and the kindness that shone through despite the cruelty she had faced. It wasn't long before Jack began to see Clara in a different light. She wasn't just the woman people had cruelly called the beast in the sack. She was a woman who had endured so much, yet still carried herself with dignity and grace. The more Jack spent time with Clara, the more he realized how much he had underestimated her. She had a heart full of love, a heart that had never been given the chance to bloom until now. And in that heart, Jack found something he thought he had lost forever: hope. Hope for a future, for a love that wasn't bound by appearances, for a chance at redemption. The truth was, Clara wasn't the beast everyone had labeled her. She was a woman who had been shaped by the world's cruelty but had not let it define her. And as Jack watched her work on his ranch, he knew that he had found something far more precious than he had ever imagined, a love that transcended the harsh judgments of society. The cowboy had found his heart, and it was in the unlikeliest of places, inside the woman who had been called a beast by the world, but who had proven to be a heart full of strength, love, and resilience. The days following Clara's arrival at Jack Thornton's ranch were slow but filled with an unspoken understanding between the two of them. Jack had always prided himself on being a man of few words, but Clara's presence brought a certain quiet comfort he hadn't realized he had been missing. She worked diligently every day, tending to the horses, feeding the cattle, and making sure the small cabin stayed warm. Clara's gentle nature made it easy for Jack to forget the cruelty of the past, yet there was something about the way she carried herself that kept him at a distance. Perhaps it was the memories of his own heartbreak, or maybe the lingering uncertainty of what he had gotten himself into. As the days turned into weeks, Clara's quiet strength started to shine through, and Jack found himself watching her more than he had intended. At first, he noticed her smile, the one she would give to the animals when they nuzzled against her, as if she was returning the kindness they offered. But it wasn't just her smile. It was the way she carried herself, her grace and movement despite her size, her resilience. Clara had once been labeled a beast, but Jack was beginning to see her as something much more. Still, Jack kept his emotions buried, too afraid to face the feelings stirring inside him. He had never been one for love, especially not after the pain he had endured in his past. His first love had been ripped away from him by the cruelty of fate, and he swore never to give his heart away again. Clara, however, had a way of making him forget his resolve. One afternoon, as Jack worked on fixing the fence, Clara came out to help. She had noticed a loose board that needed attention, and though Jack was already working on it, she insisted on taking it over. Her determination was something Jack couldn't ignore. She worked with focus, humming a soft tune under her breath, as if the act of fixing the fence was as natural to her as breathing. It was in that moment that Jack realized something had shifted. He had never seen her as anything other than someone in need of help, but now, he saw her as an equal, someone who could stand alongside him. And for the first time in a long time, he realized he no longer wanted to be alone. As the days went on, Jack began to struggle with his growing feelings for Clara. He had watched her fight her own battles for so long, and now, seeing her in a different light, he found it hard to keep his distance. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jack found himself sitting outside the cabin, staring into the fire. Clara joined him shortly after, taking a seat beside him. She had a quiet way about her, always content with the simple things in life. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound being the crackling of the fire. Finally, Clara spoke, breaking the silence. "Jack, I know you've been keeping your distance," she said softly, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to be afraid of me. I won't bite." Jack looked at her, a mixture of guilt and confusion washing over him. He hadn't meant to keep her at arm's length, but he didn't know how to let someone in. "I'm not afraid of you, Clara," he replied, his voice rough. "I'm afraid of me. I've been hurt before, and I promised myself I wouldn't go through that again." Clara smiled, a soft, knowing smile that made Jack's heart skip a beat. "We all have our scars," she said, her eyes meeting his. "But sometimes, those scars are what make us who we are, and they don't have to define us." Jack felt the weight of her words sink in, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir deep inside him, something he thought he had lost forever. He looked at Clara, truly looked at her, and in that moment, he realized that he was no longer looking at the beast in the sack. He was looking at a woman who had endured more than most people could ever imagine, and yet still had the strength to love, to care, and to stand tall in the face of adversity. Jack didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. He didn't want to face it alone. And as he sat there next to Clara, feeling the warmth of the fire and the even greater warmth of her presence, he knew that he was beginning to understand what it meant to truly open his heart once more. As the weeks went by, Jack found himself spending more and more time with Clara. It wasn't just the chores that kept him busy, it was her. There was something about her presence that softened the harshness of his past, something that made the weight of the years of solitude seem less heavy. They worked side by side every day, and though they didn't say much, there was a comfort in the silence between them. Jack had always been a man of few words, but with Clara, he didn't need to speak. Her quiet strength and resilience spoke volumes, and the longer he was around her, the more he realized how wrong he had been to judge her based on nothing but her appearance. He saw in her the heart of a fighter, a woman who had been beaten down by life but had never let it break her. Clara was no longer the beast in the sack to him. She was a woman who had overcome unimaginable obstacles, and she did so with a grace and dignity that was impossible to ignore. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The colors of the sky were a mix of orange and pink, and the air was cool with the promise of evening. Jack, who had never been one to express his feelings, found himself looking at Clara in a way he never had before. There was a warmth in his chest, a feeling that made his heart beat just a little faster. Clara turned to him, catching his gaze. "What is it, Jack?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. Jack swallowed hard, trying to find the words that had been sitting on the tip of his tongue for so long. "I've been thinking," he started, his voice low and rough, "about how wrong I was when I first met you. I never gave you a chance. I saw what people said about you, and I believed it." Clara's eyes softened as she listened, and she shifted closer, her presence warm beside him. "People believe what they want to believe," she said, her voice full of understanding. "But that doesn't make it true." Jack nodded slowly, the truth of her words sinking in. "No," he agreed, "it doesn't." They sat in silence for a few moments, the only sound being the rustling of the wind through the trees. Jack could feel the weight of his past lifting ever so slightly. He had spent so many years running from his emotions, afraid to face the pain that lingered inside him. But with Clara, it felt different. She wasn't asking for him to be someone else. She wasn't expecting him to fix everything. She was simply there, offering him the one thing he had longed for without realizing it: acceptance. "You're not what people say about you, Clara," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're so much more." Clara looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. But there was none. Jack's gaze was steady, filled with something deeper than friendship. "I don't know if I can fix what's broken in me," Jack continued, his voice low but sincere. "But with you, I feel like I might be able to try." Clara's heart swelled with emotion, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the walls she had built around herself begin to crumble. Jack wasn't just seeing her for who she was on the outside. He was seeing the person she had always been on the inside. A person who had been hurt, yes, but who had also learned to love and forgive. She reached out, placing a hand on his, the warmth of her touch grounding him in the moment. "We can try together," she said softly, her voice full of quiet strength. "You don't have to do it alone." Jack looked at her, his heart full of gratitude for the woman who had come into his life and changed everything. For so long, he had kept his distance from the world, afraid of being hurt again. But now, he found himself wanting to open up, to let someone in. And Clara, in her own way, had shown him that love wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. As the night settled in around them, Jack and Clara sat together in the quiet of the ranch, the bond between them growing stronger with every passing day. They weren't perfect, and they hadn't solved all of life's challenges, but for the first time in a long while, Jack felt like he was on the right path. And for the first time in forever, he didn't feel so alone. As the weeks passed, the connection between Jack and Clara deepened. They were no longer just two strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were becoming partners, learning to trust each other, to lean on each other when things got tough. The quiet solitude of Jack's ranch had become a place where Clara could finally feel like she belonged. No longer was she the outcast, the beast in the sack, a label that had haunted her for so long. Instead, she found a kind of peace in the simple rhythm of ranch life. The days were long, filled with hard work, but Clara never once complained. She was grateful for the second chance that Jack had given her, a chance to start over, to rebuild her life. For the first time in years, she felt hopeful. Jack, too, found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. For so long, he had kept his heart locked away, afraid of the pain that might come with caring for someone. But Clara had a way of breaking down those walls, gently, without asking for anything in return. Her strength, her kindness, her ability to forgive even when the world had not been kind to her, it all captivated him. One evening, as they finished up their work for the day, Jack found himself standing on the porch, looking out at the horizon. Clara joined him, her presence as steady and grounding as the earth beneath their feet. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Clara asked, her voice soft. Jack nodded, his eyes fixed on the fading light of the setting sun. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It's peaceful. For the first time in a long time, it feels like things are right." Clara smiled, though it was a bittersweet smile. She Knew Jack had been through so much in his life, and she had, too. But in that moment, standing beside him, she felt like they were both finally starting to heal. There was no more loneliness, no more fear of being judged for who they were. They had found something in each other that was rare and precious, a kind of understanding that didn't need words. Jack turned to face Clara, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "Clara," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I never thought I'd find someone like you. I've spent so much of my life keeping people at arm's length, afraid of what would happen if I let them in. But you've changed that." Clara's heart fluttered at his words, and she felt the walls around her own heart begin to crumble. She had never expected this, never thought she would find a love like this after so many years of being rejected and ridiculed. "Jack," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know what the future holds, but I do know one thing. Being with you feels like home." Jack reached out, taking her hand in his grip strong and sure. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There were no words needed. They both knew that the journey they had started together was just beginning. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was theirs, and that was enough. The next day, as they worked side by side in the fields, Jack felt something shift inside him. The weight of his past, the bitterness, the fear of love, all of it seemed to lift, replaced by a new sense of hope. Clara had become his anchor, and he knew, without a doubt, that he was ready to face whatever came next. He didn't know if they would ever escape the whispers of the past, but he was certain of one thing: they didn't need to. They had each other, and that was all they needed. Jack and Clara's bond grew stronger with each passing day. They faced the challenges of ranch life together, hand in hand, knowing that no matter what came their way, they would always have each other. And for the first time in years, Jack felt a sense of peace he had never known before. The love he had feared, the love he had pushed away for so long, was now the very thing that gave him strength. It was the love of a woman who had been called a beast, but had proven to be a queen in her own right. And Jack was no longer afraid of what that meant. Together, they would face the future, not as two broken souls, but as two people who had found redemption in each other's arms. As the days stretched into weeks, Jack and Clara's life together became more comfortable, more secure. The rhythm of the ranch, the sounds of cattle in the morning, the steady work of tending to the land and animals, became a part of their routine, something they shared. Clara had become the heart of the ranch, and Jack, despite his quiet nature, had found peace in their shared labor. He had grown to admire her resilience and strength, but more than that, he had fallen deeply in love with her. What started as a simple act of kindness had blossomed into something much deeper. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch after a long day's work, Clara turned to Jack, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the setting sun. "Jack," she said, her voice hesitant but sincere, "do you ever think about the future? About what comes next for us?" Jack looked at her, his heart swelling with a mix of love and uncertainty. "I think about it all the time," he replied, "but I don't have all the answers. All I know is that I want to be with you." Clara smiled softly, but there was a sadness in her eyes that Jack couldn't ignore. "You know," she began, "there's still a lot of people out there who don't understand us. They don't understand why I'm here with you, or why you're here with me." Jack reached over and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Let them think what they want. We don't owe them anything. What matters is what we've built here, together." Clara nodded, but the worry still lingered in her eyes. "I know," she said quietly, "but sometimes I wonder if the world will ever see me for who I really am, instead of just what they think I am." Jack's heart ached for her. He knew the kind of pain she had endured, the isolation she had faced. It broke his heart to think of her, the woman he loved, still carrying the weight of the world's cruelty. "The world doesn't matter," Jack said, his voice steady. "What matters is what we see in each other. And I see a woman who's strong, who's kind, who's more than anyone ever gave you credit for." Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude, but also with something else, hope. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a future that could be her own, not defined by the judgment of others. The weeks passed, and Jack and Clara's life on the ranch continued. They built something real, something lasting. But their peaceful existence was soon to be tested. One afternoon, a group of men came to the ranch. They were strangers to Jack, but their faces were familiar to Clara. They were from the town, men who had never fully accepted her, men who had whispered cruel things behind her back. Jack could sense the tension in the air as the men approached, their footsteps heavy on the dry ground. Clara stiffened beside him, her hand tightening around his. "What do they want?" she whispered, her voice low with unease. Jack didn't answer right away. He had a feeling, a gut instinct, that this wouldn't be a friendly visit. As the men reached the porch, the leader of the group stepped forward, a man named Ben Rogers. He had a cold, calculating look in his eyes, the kind of man who believed in his own authority. "We've come for her," Ben said, pointing at Clara. "She doesn't belong here, not with a man like you." Jack stood tall, his fists clenched at his sides, but his voice was calm. "She's not going anywhere," he said firmly. "This is her home now." Ben sneered. "We don't care what you think," he spat. "She's nothing but trouble, and we're here to make sure she knows it." Clara's heart raced as she stood beside Jack, but she refused to back down. She had faced so much in her life, and she wasn't about to let these men intimidate her. "You can't make me leave," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "This is my life now, and I won't let you take it away from me." The men exchanged looks, sizing her up, but they could see the fire in her eyes, the strength that had carried her through all the years of cruelty. Jack stood beside her, his presence a silent promise of protection. The tension between them all was thick, but it was clear that Jack and Clara weren't backing down. Ben Rogers took a step back, his eyes narrowing in frustration. "This isn't over," he muttered before turning to leave. The men followed him, retreating into the dust, but Clara could feel the weight of their judgment lingering in the air. She had faced down the cruelty of others before, but this time, it felt different. She had Jack by her side, and for the first time, she didn't feel alone. As the dust settled, Jack turned to Clara, his hand gently brushing her hair from her face. "You're not alone," he whispered. "Not now, not ever." Clara smiled, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. She had found a place where she was seen for who she truly was, a place where she could finally be herself. And as long as they had each other, she knew they could face whatever came next. As the days continued to pass, the shadow of the confrontation with the men from town hung over the ranch. While the incident had left Clara shaken, it also strengthened her resolve. She had faced so much in her life, but with Jack beside her, she felt as if she could face anything. Jack, too, found a new strength in the aftermath. His protective instinct for Clara had only grown, and he realized that he would do whatever it took to keep her safe from the prejudices of the world. The ranch had become more than just a place of work. It was their home, their sanctuary, and Jack knew he would fight to protect it. Despite the lingering tension, life on the ranch went on. The work was never-ending, and the long days of tending to the land, the cattle, and the horses kept them both busy. But it was no longer the same, not with Clara by his side. Jack had learned to find joy in the smallest things. A shared cup of coffee in the morning, the sound of Clara's laughter echoing across the fields, and the simple comfort of knowing that they were in this together. One morning, as they sat down for breakfast, Clara looked at Jack with a softness in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. "Jack," she began, her voice quiet but filled with sincerity. "I know it hasn't been easy for either of us, but I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you've done for me. You've shown me more kindness than anyone ever has." Jack reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Clara, you don't have to thank me," he said, his voice steady. "You've done just as much for me. You've shown me a strength I didn't know I was capable of. I never thought I'd find someone who could make me feel the way you do." Clara smiled, and for the first time in a long while, she felt truly seen. Jack wasn't looking at her as the beast in the sack anymore. He saw her for who she truly was, a woman who had endured hardship, who had fought her way through life, and who had never given up, even when the world had turned its back on her. As the weeks went by, their bond continued to grow. Jack and Clara's life on the ranch wasn't perfect, but it was real. They had built something together, something that was theirs and theirs alone. Clara had come to realize that she didn't need the approval of the townspeople. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The only approval she needed was Jack's, and he had given that to her every day. Yet, as they continued to live their quiet life, the world outside the ranch never stopped. One afternoon, as Clara and Jack were out in the fields, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the property. It was Ben Rogers, the leader of the men who had come to the ranch weeks earlier. This time, he wasn't alone. A group of men from town stood behind him, their faces set in determination. Jack's stomach tightened as he saw them approach. He had hoped the trouble with the townsfolk was behind them, but it seemed that wasn't the case. Ben stopped a few feet from Jack, his expression cold. "We've had enough of this," Ben said, his voice low. "You and her don't belong here. We've come to settle this once and for all." Clara stood beside Jack, her heart pounding, but she wasn't afraid. She had faced worse than this. Jack, however, was ready to take a stand. "You can leave now," he said firmly, his hand resting on the handle of his rifle. "This is our land, and no one is going to take it from us." Ben's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, there was an unsettling silence. The tension was thick, and it felt as though everything had come down to this moment. But then, something unexpected happened. One of the men behind Ben, a younger man with a hesitant look in his eyes, stepped forward. "This has gone on long enough," he said, his voice shaky. "We're tired of the fighting. It's not right, what we've been doing." Ben turned to him, a look of anger flashing across his face, but the young man didn't back down. "She's just a woman," the young man continued, "but she's stronger than most of us put together. And Jack, he's no different. We don't have to keep doing this." There was a long pause before Ben spoke again, his voice heavy with a mixture of frustration and defeat. "You've always been a coward," he muttered, turning away. "You and your woman can have your ranch." As Ben and the others retreated, Jack and Clara stood there, their hearts racing, but their spirits high. It had taken everything they had, but they had finally stood their ground. Clara turned to Jack, her hand gently squeezing his. "We did it," she whispered, a smile breaking across her face. Jack pulled her into an embrace, feeling a weight he didn't realize he had been carrying lift off his shoulders. "We did," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And we'll keep doing it, as long as we have each other." The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, they knew they were ready for whatever came next. The days after the confrontation with the men from town seemed quieter, but the tension had not fully dissipated. Jack and Clara kept a watchful eye on the horizon, knowing that peace in their world was never guaranteed. Life on the ranch continued, though the threat of further trouble lingered in the back of their minds. As the harvest season approached, they worked harder than ever, determined to keep the ranch thriving despite the obstacles they faced. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara and Jack sat side by side on the porch, taking in the peaceful silence. The golden light cast long shadows over the land, and for a moment, it felt as though the whole world was at rest. "Jack," Clara said softly, breaking the stillness, "do you think we'll ever have a life without the constant struggle?" Jack glanced over at her, his face thoughtful. He had spent much of his life in solitude, always running from problems, always hiding from the pain of the past. But Clara had changed that. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but I do know that we have each other. And that's more than I ever thought I'd have." Clara smiled at him, her heart swelling with love for the man beside her. She had come so far since she had arrived on his doorstep, a woman judged by the world and cast aside. Now, she had a place in this world, a place by Jack's side. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. "You're right," Clara agreed. "We'll face whatever comes, together." Just then, a figure appeared on the horizon. Jack's heart sank as he recognized the man. Bert Harris, one of the men from town who had been part of the group that had confronted them earlier. He was riding alone, his face grim. As he got closer, Jack stood up, a sense of unease settling in his stomach. "What does he want now?" Jack muttered under his breath. Clara stood beside him, her posture tense, but she didn't back away. Bert rode up to the porch, his horse snorting softly in the still air. He dismounted, looking at Jack and Clara with a mixture of regret and something else. Fear, perhaps. "Jack," Bert began, his voice low and hesitant. "Clara," he nodded towards her, "I didn't come here to cause trouble." Jack's brow furrowed, suspicion creeping into his thoughts. "Then what do you want?" Bert took a deep breath, glancing over his shoulder as if checking to make sure no one was watching. "The thing is," he said, "there's a lot of people in town who are still talking. They're not happy about what happened, about you two standing up to us." Jack's grip tightened on the porch railing, his anger rising. "We've already dealt with that," he said, his voice firm. Bert nodded, looking genuinely apologetic. "I know, Jack. But the truth is, we're outnumbered. People have been whispering about taking things into their own hands, and it's not going to stop until something is done. Clara stepped forward, her voice steady. What do you mean? Are you threatening us? Bert shook his head quickly, his eyes wide. No, I'm not threatening you. I'm trying to warn you. There's talk about a mob forming, about storming the ranch. People don't want things to stay the way they are. Jack's stomach twisted, and Clara felt her heart race. What do we do? She asked, her voice calm but filled with concern. Bert looked over at Jack, his expression filled with regret. I came here because I don't want to see things go that far. I'm telling you this because I think you two deserve a chance to get out before it gets worse. The town isn't safe for you anymore. Jack's eyes narrowed. He had spent too many years running, too many years avoiding confrontation, but this time was different. This time, he had something to protect. He had Clara. We're not running, Jack said firmly, his voice filled with determination. This is our land, and no one is going to take it from us. We'll stand our ground. Bert looked like he wanted to argue, but he seemed to realize that it was pointless. Just be careful, he said, turning to leave. I'm not saying I agree with what they're planning, but you're going to need more than just your hands to fight them. With that, Bert mounted his horse and rode off into the distance, leaving Jack and Clara standing together on the porch. They didn't speak for a few moments, the weight of the situation sinking in. Jack felt a sense of fear rising in his chest, but it was quickly replaced by a fierce resolve. We're not going to let them run us off, Jack said, his voice low but unwavering. We've fought for everything we have, and we're not going to stop now. Clara looked up at him, her eyes filled with trust and love. We're in this together, she said softly. Always. The sun was setting, casting a soft orange glow across the land. It was a peaceful sight, but beneath it, a storm was brewing. Jack and Clara knew that the battle ahead would not be easy, but they were ready. For the first time, they felt like they truly belonged, and together, they would face whatever came next. As the days wore on, the tension between Jack and Clara and the townspeople only seemed to grow. The threat of a mob had been hanging over their heads like a storm cloud, and despite their best efforts to prepare, Jack and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. They worked harder than ever, reinforcing the ranch, making sure their cattle were secure, and gathering what little supplies they could. Jack's mind was constantly on edge, his eyes scanning the horizon every morning and evening, always watching for any sign of trouble. Clara, too, had a quiet determination. She had never backed down from a fight in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. The life she had built with Jack meant everything to her, and she wasn't going to let it be taken away without a fight. One evening, just as the sun was setting and the air grew cool with the promise of night, a group of men appeared at the edge of the property. This time, there were no words, no shouting from the distance. The men moved quietly, deliberately, as if they had been planning this moment for a long time. Jack's heart dropped into his stomach as he recognized the leader of the group. It was Ben Rogers again, the same man who had led the group to the ranch before, but now he was accompanied by a few other men from town, their faces grim and set in determination. Clara stood beside Jack, her heart pounding, but she didn't show fear. She stood tall, ready to face whatever came their way. What do they want this time? Clara whispered, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Jack didn't answer right away. He knew that whatever they were here for, it wasn't going to be good. Stay close, Jack said, his voice low. He grabbed his rifle, feeling the weight of it in his hands, a comforting reminder of the battles he had fought before. As the men reached the porch, Ben stepped forward. Jack, he said, his voice surprisingly calm. Clara, he nodded toward her. We've come to settle this. Jack's jaw tightened. He had no doubt that Ben wasn't here for a peaceful resolution. Settle what? Jack asked, his voice sharp. Ben hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the ranch, as if he was trying to gauge Jack's response. This place, Ben said, finally meeting Jack's eyes. This ranch doesn't belong to you, and it sure as hell doesn't belong to her. Clara stepped forward, her eyes flashing with defiance. This ranch is ours, she said, her voice steady and unyielding. We've worked hard for it, and no one is going to take it from us. Ben's face twisted in frustration, but he didn't back down. You don't get it, do you? He said, his voice growing louder. You're not wanted here. People talk. They've had enough of this thing you're doing. You and her. It's not right. Clara took a deep breath, refusing to let his words get to her. You don't get to decide what's right for us, she said, her voice calm, but filled with conviction. We found a place here, and we're not leaving. Ben stepped closer, his fists clenched at his sides. The other men behind him remained silent, watching the standoff unfold. Jack could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment hanging heavy between them. For a brief second, Jack's mind flashed back to his past, back to the times when he had walked away from fights, when he had avoided conflict to keep the peace. But that man was gone now. The man standing here, beside Clara, was someone who had learned to stand his ground, to fight for what mattered. You think you can just come in here and take it all away? Jack said, his voice low but full of authority. This is our home, and we'll defend it, no matter who stands in our way. Ben's eyes darkened, but instead of retaliating with violence, he stepped back, his shoulders slumping as if he had realized something. I don't want to do this, he said, his voice suddenly weary. But there are forces in town that want you gone. And if I don't do something, I'm going to be just as much of a target as you. Clara's gaze softened as she looked at Ben, and for a moment, Jack saw something in her eyes, a mix of sympathy and understanding. She knew the struggle he was facing. We understand, she said gently. But we're not running, and we're not giving up. We found something here, and we'll fight to keep it. Ben didn't say anything in response. He just looked at the ground, as if weighed down by the gravity of the situation. After a long pause, he finally nodded. I don't want to see either of you hurt, he said, his voice barely a whisper. But I can't stop what's coming. With that, he turned and walked back to his men, his footsteps heavy with the weight of the unspoken threat that still hung in the air. As the men disappeared into the distance, Jack and Clara stood there, the weight of their words still heavy between them. Clara turned to Jack, her hand resting on his arm. What now? She asked softly. Jack didn't hesitate. Now, he said, his voice steady, we prepare, and we stand our ground. The days following Ben's warning were filled with tension, but also a quiet determination. Jack and Clara knew what they had to do. They couldn't let fear dictate their lives any longer. This ranch, their home, meant everything to them, and they would fight for it. The town's whispers had only strengthened their resolve. They would no longer be pushed around, not by anyone. They spent the next few days fortifying the ranch. Jack worked on the fences, ensuring that no one could easily trespass, while Clara kept an eye on the cattle and the barn, organizing supplies in case they needed to hold out. Every night, they kept watch, both of them alert, knowing that something could happen at any moment. Jack had grown accustomed to solitude, but now, having Clara by his side made all the difference. They shared more than just the load of ranch work. They shared a future they both believed in. It was a bond forged in hardship, but it was stronger than anything either of them had ever known. One afternoon, the storm they had been anticipating finally came. A group of men from town, led by Ben Rogers, appeared on horseback, their faces hard and determined. Jack's heart sank, but he stood tall, stepping out onto the porch where Clara stood beside him. There was no turning back now. As the men approached, Ben called out to Jack. We've had enough, he said, his voice sharp and full of authority. You and her need to leave. Now. Jack stood his ground, his voice calm but firm. We're not going anywhere, he replied. This is our home. If you want to take it, you're going to have to go through us. The tension in the air was palpable, the men behind Ben shifting uncomfortably. They had come prepared, but they weren't as sure as Ben seemed to be. Clara stood beside Jack, her presence unwavering. For the first time, Ben seemed to hesitate. His eyes flickered toward Clara, then back at Jack, as if weighing his options. You think you can just defy the whole town? Ben spat. You've made a lot of enemies, Jack. Jack's eyes narrowed, but his voice remained steady. It doesn't matter how many enemies I have. I'm not going to let you take what we've built. We're staying. Clara stepped forward, her voice strong and clear. You don't get to decide that. We've earned our place here, and we won't let you take it away. There was a long silence as Ben's men exchanged looks, their uncertainty growing. Jack could see it in their eyes. They weren't as committed to this as Ben was. The mob mentality that had once been so strong now seemed to waver. Ben turned to his men, his face reddening with frustration. Are we really going to let them win? He demanded. But the others didn't respond immediately. It was clear that the tide had turned. They had come with the intention of running Jack and Clara off their land. But they were now facing something they hadn't expected, a united front. Clara and Jack weren't just fighting for land. They were fighting for respect, for the right to live on their terms. The others hesitated, and it was all the opening Jack and Clara needed. "We fought for this," Jack said, his voice unwavering. "And we'll keep fighting. This is our land, and no one's going to take it from us." The silence stretched on, and then, one by one, the men began to turn away. Ben stood frozen, his face twisted in anger, but it was clear he had lost the support of the group. He glared at Jack and Clara for a moment longer, his fists clenched at his sides. Finally, he muttered something under his breath and spurred his horse into motion. The others followed suit, leaving Jack and Clara standing there, victorious but exhausted. As the men rode off, Clara looked at Jack, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and pride. They had done it. They had stood their ground and won. Jack took Clara's hand in his, squeezing it gently. "We did it," he said, his voice low with emotion. Clara smiled up at him, her eyes full of gratitude. "Together," she whispered. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the ranch. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jack and Clara felt like they could breathe. The battle wasn't over, and there would always be challenges ahead, but they had proven something to themselves and to the world. They were stronger than anyone had given them credit for. And no matter what came next, they knew they would face it together.